Yes, thanks so much, Laura. With Alan Joyce now, and of course, we appreciate your time. Just today, not only you reported this $1 billion loss, but also that revenues from Qantas, as a result of not flying internationally or even domestically in many areas, $7 billion in a loss of revenue. I mean, it really is a hit. Can the airline sustain that hit?
Well, the airlines coped with it exceptionally well. $7 billion in revenue lost, and we managed to move that down to $1 billion profit loss. So coping with standing people down, coping with reducing our costs, coping with getting our cash burn down. And we're in a great position now where we're back into positive cash flow, which means that we could survive like this for a long time. And we have one of the best liquidity positions of any airline in the world with $4.2 billion in cash. And we're only one of 8 airlines in the world that's investment grade rated. So Qantas is in a unique, a very strong position compared to any airline around the globe. But it has meant we have to have done dramatic things to survive and to recover in the future. Unfortunately, 8,500 people will be leaving the business. Unfortunately, we still have 11,500 stood down, and 7,500 of them will be stood down until international starts again. But there are signs of optimism. The domestic market went from 20% in the first quarter of this financial year to 40% of pre-COVID levels in the second quarter. We're at 60% of pre-COVID levels. We think in the last quarter we'll get to 80%. And if we can have some certainty on borders, we should be able to exceed 100% because there's a lot of pent-up demand out there for people to travel again.
I want to take you to borders now and start with state borders. You've literally said that you believe the states and federal government should come to a hard and fast decision on borders. And you say by the end of April, they should all agree that there will be no more border closures. Is it as simple as that?
Well, we're saying because of the vaccine rollout and now the areas of vulnerability, hotel quarantine, international crews travelling, will all be vaccinated by April. Is that a good period to say the risk has been eliminated or significantly reduced? Why can't we declare domestic borders are very unlikely to close and should stay open? And we've asked the premiers, and maybe it's not April, maybe it's May, but there should be a definitive time frame in the vaccine rollout that allows them to commit to something like that. And we've asked for that discussion with the help of the chief medical officers to take place. We think that'll make a big difference. There's a lot of small businesses, cafes, tour operators that are suffering. And if we can get our domestic capacity back to pre-COVID or ahead of pre-COVID levels, we can help them. The people in Cairns, the people that are going to lose JobKeeper at the end of March, the people in Cairns, the people in Tasmania, these small operators, these small cafes, getting that tourism system to start functioning again. So hopefully, and we are having good dialogue, we'll get some clarity and some certainty around the borders, which I think is what people need.
Well, the other borders are the international borders, and clearly your revenue from international travel has gone to virtually zero.
Yes.
But now there's a situation where you've said, right, we have an aim to try and open international flights from October this year. You'll allow people to, again, to start to book those international flights. But isn't that also almost like a line in the sand to government to say that's where we think, at least anyway, the borders can justifiably be open?
Well, first of all, we completely understand this is the government's decision, and the government have to look at a lot of data before they can make a firm decision of when that occurs. They're telling us they want to see whether the vaccine blocks transmission. They want to see what these new variants, whether the vaccine's effective against them. We can understand there are still a lot of decisions to be made, but having seen how good the vaccine is performing around the globe, having seen that we're likely to have the full population vaccinated by the end of October, that raises the question about why can't we at that stage, if everything goes right and the continued good news continues, why can't we open up? Now, we have to make some planning assumptions because we need to give our people certainty about when it's likely. Now, it's not likely before October, we think, from what we're seeing. So people have taken secondary employment, those 7,500 people. We want to tell them this is our best estimate. It could change. Maybe we're being pessimistic and it could be a bit earlier. Maybe we're being optimistic and it could be a bit later. But it gives them something to plan on. And it also gives us something to plan on when we get aircraft activated, when we get the capabilities up and running, and how we put those plans in. We can't operate in a vacuum. So that's the date we picked, and we think there's good logic to it, and it's probably a bit conservative in reality if everything goes well.
OK, but there's 7,500 people who, from the end of March, when JobKeeper ends, your employees who have no income unless they've got a second job until you start to fly again. Now, for many of those families, it's going to be pretty tough to make ends meet. So what does the government do to help support not just your employees, but other employees in the tourism and hospitality area?
Yeah, so we're very conscious of that, and we know that, and we've said to the government that between the end of March and when the government opens up, because government decisions, the international borders, these people will not have work at Qantas. They will still be stood down because we'll have a blockage of work. We won't have a capability of flying internationally, and the aircraft will be parked. So we asked the government to consider, we know they want to stop JobKeeper. We know that the economy needs to get on its own 2 feet again. And for a lot of the economy, it's performing exceptionally well. But for these 7,500 people, we're asking the government to look at solutions to try and help. And we're having constructive dialogue going with the government. And I know they're looking at other particular industries that are still impacted by the border closures and how they'll help them. We're hoping that by the end of March, the government will have reached some conclusions on what that looks like.
OK, so you in this last half have taken about $700 million of government support. $460 million of that is JobKeeper. What you're saying to the government is after March, you would hope that they might extend that support to the airline to make certain that your jobs, that your people's jobs are kept intact, or they keep attached to the airline.
Now, to make it clear, you know, the JobKeeper form at the moment consists of money that comes for people that are fully stood down and goes directly to them. And the majority of that 460 went to people. We didn't keep it. It went directly to people that had no role. A chunk of that money, less than half of it, went to subsidise the jobs when people were stood up. What we're saying post the end of March is we know JobKeeper has to end in that form, but is there something that could be done for those 7,500 people where Qantas wouldn't be taking any of that cash? That cash would be going to the individual, which is what's happened since the international borders have been stopped. And is there a way of helping them get through till when the borders open? So that's the component we're interested in, not the full JobKeeper package.
Just one very last quick one, and that is airfares post these borders being reopened, particularly international airfares. If there's fewer airlines around the world travelling, there's going to be less capacity. There's going to be demand. Does that mean that airfares go through the roof to 1960s, 70s levels?
I think it's the opposite. I think a lot of airlines will go bankrupt through this. Qantas is one of the strongest in the world. I think IATA or CAPA, Pierre Harbison, thinks 40% of airlines could go bankrupt by the time this is over. A lot of airlines are a lot weaker than Qantas. But Qantas has a lot of aircraft that we're planning to park. The 380s are in the desert. I'd rather fly the aircraft, get people back to work, and if there's any demand and any hope of doing that, even with really low airfares, we'll put the aircraft back in. So we'll be trying to stimulate the demand, trying to get people to come back in the air, trying to get people to travel internationally, try and get foreign tourists to come into Australia. And I think the airfares will be low for some time to encourage that travel.
Alan Joyce, many thanks for your time.